He was once a revered hero, but voluntarily descended into the life of a mere police officer. The reason a hero cannot take lives at will, while a police officer can carry out capital punishment. Not long ago, the protagonist captured the most ruthless criminal with white hair, but the cost was the sacrifice of his entire team. At that moment, he had the chance to kill him directly, yet he found himself unable to make the final decision. He had promised his teammates that he would let the criminal face the law. This was the choice he regretted the most. The white-haired criminal was sentenced to death and was temporarily held at the heavily guarded Ruculus prison. The protagonist sat alone at home, watching the news on TV. Besides the verdict for the white-haired criminal, a memorial service for the fallen heroes was taking place that night. As he listened to the somber news, his brother approached and turned off the television. His brother, a police officer, looked at the protagonist with disappointment for not having killed the white-haired criminal himself. Yet, he urged the protagonist to heed the words of his friends. The echoes of his teammates' voices lingered in his mind. A hero's duty is to save lives, not take them, even when it comes to the most vicious of criminals. They should allow the law to punish them. No matter the circumstances, killing is never justifiable. Although the protagonist felt a sense of injustice, he remained steadfast to his promise. His brother believed that the criminal must face legal judgment, which would then be enforced by the police. Finally, his brother told him, "The white-haired criminal will be executed next week." After that, the two attended the memorial service for the heroes. Everything seemed to settle here, but the protagonist could not foresee that a week later, he would be attending his own brother's funeral. In that moment, despair washed over him as he struggled to comprehend what had transpired. Why was the condemned criminal unharmed while the executioner, his brother, was dead? As he silently stood by his brother's grave, a voice suddenly rang out. The speaker was none other than the director of Ruculus prison. He handed the protagonist a tablet displaying the execution report for the white-haired criminal. At the moment of his brother's execution, Ruculus prison experienced a power outage. Simultaneously, the white-haired criminal unleashed a powerful electromagnetic pulse. Several executioners were violently thrown aside, and the white-haired criminal seized his chance, breaking free and slaughtering them all. The protagonist could hardly believe his eyes as he absorbed the information on the screen. The prison director revealed that the situation was dire. Aside from the white-haired criminal, every other inmate had been released. Fortunately, the prison had managed to close its gates in time to prevent the death row inmates from escaping. Inside, however, the guards had no hope of escaping. At this moment, the protagonist gritted his teeth and demanded to know who controlled the electromagnetic pulse. Yet, the prison director had no answers. He was there solely to ask the protagonist to quell the uprising at Ruculus prison. For this, the protagonist is of course more than willing to serve. However, he has a condition of his own. His comrades have told him that a hero's duty is to save lives, and his police mentor has stated that only the law can judge a man, only the police can carry out the death penalty. Thus, in the Ruculus prison, he will no longer be a hero, he will become a police officer. "I am Officer Shu Jiang Lu, filthy scum. Take note." The criminals on the first floor, seeing the protagonist in his police uniform, still do not recognize the severity of the situation. They think their opponent is still hesitant to take action, so one by one, they charge forward. As a result, the protagonist merely throws a punch, immediately clearing a path. Meanwhile, the bosses on the lower floors sense the unusual atmosphere. The white-haired one becomes even more excited, laughing heartily. Finally, here he comes. The protagonist adjusts his attire, for from this moment on, he will be the executor of the death penalty. With kindness, he advises the criminals attempting to escape to return and wear their collars. Yet, none of them comprehend the gravity of the situation. Therefore, the protagonist has no choice but to demonstrate a fraction of his strength, as they hear that the police are about to execute the death penalty upon them. The criminals facing him are filled with rage. Clearly, the inmates on their level are merely individuals carrying multiple lives on their backs. Why should they have to die? This is not a trivial matter. The fools continue to scream for lawyers while the clever ones prepare their rebuttals. While others distract the protagonist, a blue-haired thug suddenly appears behind him. He believes he has found freedom, but has drastically underestimated the protagonist. In an instant, the protagonist coldly pivots and delivers a kick that sends the blue-haired thug crashing to the ground. This scene leaves everyone in stunned silence. The surrounding area falls eerily quiet. At that moment, the protagonist kindly presents a choice: return and wear the collar or face death. Seeing the criminals hesitate, a voice rises from the crowd. Naturally, they opt for the latter. The man declares that they are all destined to die anyway. Why not take a chance? After all, this choice is heavily stacked against them. However, in the face of their mockery, the protagonist replies, "This is the last mercy I offer you." As they see the police officer before them genuinely serious, the criminals begin to feel a creeping fear. In that very moment, a loud scream erupts from the man. Everyone turns to stare at him in astonishment. The man asserts that heroes are nothing to fear. If they just kill him, they can enjoy their freedom. The protagonist realizes that the person standing before him is none other than the one the prison warden referred to as scum before his arrival. Earlier, the warden had introduced the protagonist to the basic conditions within these walls. Ruculus prison categorizes criminals by their level of danger. Among them, one floor holds 300 inmates, primarily serial killers. The lowest floor contains over 100 criminals capable of endangering an entire village. There are over 30 criminals on the second level, which could put a city in danger. There are 10 criminals on the third level, which could put a country in danger. There are 5 criminals on the fourth level, which could put a continent in danger. The last 5 layers, including the white hair, have 3 people who may endanger the world. Of course, the male protagonist does not face many real enemies because the prisoners are in a mess and they have the opportunity to stab each other in the back. Racin, an ability to enhance others through sound. Looking at the person in front of the male protagonist, he confessed his crimes. He killed 7 civilians and 1 second-level hero. However, the other party corrected the male protagonist's statement that there were 10 people in total because the female protagonist was pregnant with twins. The male protagonist looked coldly at the other party's ugly face. This was confirmed by the prison warden, and the male protagonist breathed a sigh of relief, as if he no longer needed to be careful about his own strength. The man across from him still believed that the male protagonist was just scaring him because compared to other heroes, he could be said to be an unknown person. They even believed that the male protagonist used the lives of his teammates as bait to catch white hair, so when Heil Larson activated the abilities of all the prisoners, they became arrogant. However, the male protagonist only needs to kick his leg to make the person in front fly away. The next male protagonist opens the serious mode with a punch. All the criminals seem to fall under the power of God. The male protagonist lands behind on a land with no survivors. The execution on the first floor is over. When a hero decides to give up his principles, there will be a lion mountain and a snowy sea behind him. Along the way, he doesn't know how many people he has killed, even if he occasionally encounters some survivors. You would give them a choice, either wear a necklace or die. But so far, no one has chosen to wear a necklace. Usually, criminals will jump up and then they will die. Of course, some people think they're very smart. First, pretend to surrender. Agree to wear a necklace, hoping that the male protagonist will not be noticed, then suddenly attack. And the final result is that regardless of the difference in strength, the criminal's attack is not enough to tear the male protagonist's skin. Những kẻ không có khả năng thể chất thật đáng thương chỉ có thể bắn từ xa mà không bao giờ cảm nhận được sự thỏa mãn khi tự tay hủy diệt kẻ khác. Vì vậy, nam chính cũng đã trải nghiệm cảm giác đấm vào thịt. Cảm giác này thật sự rất tuyệt. After dealing with the scum, the protagonist finally faced a familiar figure, Chuck Field. In the early days of the Hero Alliance, they had captured him for his heinous acts and his arrogant demeanor, showing no remorse even when death loomed near. At that time, the protagonist had wanted to end him, but his merciful captain had intervened. Though deeply dissatisfied, he had no choice but to turn away. Now, confronted with this scoundrel once more, the protagonist, ever virtuous, made a choice, one that the outcome was all too predictable. With that, the protagonist ceased his idle chatter, striking like a bolt of lightning towards his foe. Yet, the opponent did not perish. It turned out that the earlier image was merely an illusion. Field began to recount that his love for killing stemmed from a desire to remain forever etched in the memories of his victims. Even in death, they could never forget him, for embedding his image into their eyes was his unique ability. Moreover, he remembered each one distinctly and could summon them back again. Just as he was about to present a victim, his arm was severed from his body. The protagonist observed calmly, realizing that Field was a criminal who could help him fulfill this task himself. Such a mouth could truly weave words, but it seemed he lacked the means to evade my strike. At this moment, Field understood he would meet his end here, yet he had one last question. Do you remember how many lives you've taken on this journey? The protagonist replied that he had no need to remember the likes of such filth. But just as he spoke, the faces of his fallen comrades reappeared before him. Again, the holy figure with the white fur began to persuade the protagonist that killing was not the answer. Seeing this, Feld thought he might survive, not realizing this only fueled the protagonist's rage. The very notion of not killing was what caused him to lose his brother. Without hesitation, he split them apart. At this moment, the protagonist's expression darkened. What more is there? They hold no value at all. Feld could hardly believe that his opponent could so coldly sever the bonds with those comrades he once cherished. He heard the protagonist's chilling words. After all, they were merely illusions. Upon hearing this, Feld was stunned, his eyes widening. In the next instant, he was cleaved in two. The protagonist coldly declared that he was no hero, but rather a warning. Feld was left gasping for breath. Watching the retreating figure of his foe, he thought, "You're not a warning, you're simply a monster." Meanwhile, outside the prison, three figures observed everything intently, analyzing the protagonist's demeanor within. A girl, barely able to hide her excitement, appears. She is the one I've been searching for. The man who had earlier tried to make a show of himself was swiftly torn apart. Just moments ago, the protagonist had dealt with the filth on the ground. Immediately after, the prison director approached, offering comfort and asking if the protagonist needed a moment to rest. However, the protagonist firmly asserted that he needed no rest, insisting the director open the door immediately. The prison director didn't say much, but he had one more task to entrust to the protagonist, hoping he could bring back a warning from those still alive down there. The protagonist wanted to know how many survivors remained on each level, but the director didn't have that information. From the first basement floor onward, communication devices had been destroyed, only the fifth floor remained intact. Just like those inside, they yearned for someone to see and hear them. After hearing this, the protagonist demanded the director to open the door. As the director issued the command, the heavy iron door slowly lifted. At this moment, he cautioned the protagonist to be careful, for the gap between the basement and the first floor was as vast as heaven and earth. With the door slightly ajar, the protagonist immediately turned serious. Behind that door lay a trap, ready to strike mercilessly. Bullets, infused with lethal energy, flew chaotically. The prison director shouted in panic for the protagonist, but in the next instant, a prisoner appeared before him and swiftly tightened his grip around the director's neck. Lifting him high, the prisoner proclaimed himself as the prison director here. What a catch, a big fish. Observing the graceful movements of his opponent, the man boldly called to his comrades, "Hey brothers, this is the prison director. Come on, line up and deal with him properly." At that moment, he attempted to flaunt his bravado, but upon witnessing the scene behind him, he froze in shock. For in that fleeting instant, all he could see was a swarm of flies. He couldn't believe his eyes as he looked up. The result was that the protagonist had leapt onto his head, and with a powerful punch, the impact sent the director flying. The man lay sprawled out on the ground. At that moment, the protagonist stood tall, looking down at the director, lying defeated below. "You shouldn't follow me, it's too dangerous." Hearing this, the director could only stammer in response, I understand." As he saw the protagonist about to leave, the the director called out after him. Is there anything else you want to say about the shark being captured by the hero? In a solitary room on the first floor, the protagonist coldly stated that he was already aware and turned away to leave. Meanwhile, in the solitary room of the basement, all the remaining prisoners huddled together, listening to the booming sounds from outside, praying for their friends to be saved. Of course, this hope was soon shattered unintentionally. The woman, a former hero known as Shark, had killed 28 heroes before she paid no mind to these foolish beings. Instantly, her arrogant attitude provoked a brawny man. "Do you want to die?" Yet the woman seemed to have caught a glimpse of a joke, a bunch of trash. "Have you managed to kill anyone powerful yet?" The man, provoked, felt his power surging, emanating an aura of authority. But as the saying goes, beauty fades in just 3 seconds. In the very next moment, he was split in two. The woman had transformed her hair and nails sharpened to a deadly edge. Once a hero, she had taken down many villains and found ways to eliminate those with powers. Moreover, she knew a crucial detail about the protagonist, prompting her to invite the others to join forces. She offered to share her knowledge on how to hunt down those with abilities. Meanwhile, outside the prison, a trio observed the protagonist's actions, with the small girl feeling skeptical. Clearly, his earlier decision had been to save her little brother. He even used an electric shock to do so. One man in the group questioned, "Isn't that hero without any help?" The girl responded cheerfully, "That was in the past. He doesn't resemble a hero anymore." Even so, the other two believed they could only choose one. After all, polyandry was illegal. Hearing this, the girl felt a twinge of confusion. It was indeed a tough decision. In the end, whoever survived would be her destiny. "I am truly a genius." The man merely raised a finger, and countless dark sparks rained down from the heavens. As the protagonist prepared to make a kill, Shark began to share intel on him, for he too had once been a seasoned hero. At that moment, a man with white fur named Speaky asked a question. What good is knowing his abilities? After all, he's a member of the First-Class Hero Alliance, while the strongest among us are only third class. To this, Shark responded confidently, "Of course, they are aware of this." But since Hero rose took charge of the Alliance, he has initiated a reform for heroes. First, he redefined what it means to be a hero, preventing them from killing villains. Secondly, he regularly organized cooperative training teams for the heroes. Finally, he abolished the hero ranking system. The reason Shark spoke so extensively was that when the protagonist joined the Alliance, the ranking system had already been eliminated. He had no achievements to boast about, to the extent that people outside even rumored he was involved with Rosa. Yet, despite this, he could still take care of all the prisoners on the first floor instantly, while those present barely reached the second class of heroes in strength. Nevertheless, Shark smiled brightly. The first floor was merely a den of minions. Even with a few of you here, it could be handled easily, right? Each person here carries the weight of thousands of lives, incomparable to those on the first floor. Of course, Shark emphasized that this did not imply weakness on the part of the others. Rather, they understood his vulnerabilities. After centuries of the emergence of those with powers, scholars had categorized them into 3 major types: physical abilities that enhance the body, creative powers that can manifest objects from thin air. And this special ability is not of 2 types. Shark said they discovered the male protagonist's weakness because they saw him training, and he had a fatal weakness that he didn't know how to avoid. So other prisoners chose to join a plan against the male protagonist. They first separated the prisoners to catch the attention of the male protagonist. When the male protagonist saw them, his first choice was still to wear the necklace or die. However, in response, he was attacked by ambushers from both sides. Parents and Spitz conducted remote monitoring through brainwaves, and as predicted by the Shark, the male protagonist did not evade the attack at all. So the Shark secretly released some small things in this attack, ability control devices collected by the police. Even if a level 1 hero wears 15 abilities, they will be completely sealed. This time they have prepared 30. This is a very successful plan, where all the equipment is installed on the protagonist through people with special abilities. So the prisoners start cheering, leaving less than half the way out of champagne celebration. But they don't know that the shark's plan has three fatal mistakes. Firstly, the male protagonist's strength far exceeds everything that a level 1 hero should possess. All control devices were crushed by him. Seeing the situation was not good, the shark immediately ordered the execution of the second plan. The second mistake is that the male protagonist has both physical strength and special abilities. As long as he points to the black light in the air, the prisoners will be blown away, and the warning is harmless. The correct control is terrifying. When the situation is not good, the survivors upstairs hope to wear collars and beg for protection. The third mistake is that the male protagonist will not give them a second chance to choose. So far, except for the two people behind, everyone else has been executed. Now, Spitz is completely scared and crazy, so he angrily asks the shark next to him. This is different from what was said before. The person next to him has been chattering incessantly, while the shark doubts his life. 30 of them were useless. Listening to the constant noise around them, the shark finally couldn't help but explode. They angrily deformed, with one toe and a man on the road. This dog poop dared to shout at me and vent for a while, but they still couldn't calm down. If you're so strong, why don't you fight on the front line? Is that unreasonable? It's really unreasonable. Suddenly, a strange voice came from behind him. He had always thought it was a warning from the mat, but now it quietly ran away. He was looking for death, and when he was discovered, the police were so scared that tears streamed down his face, and he screamed for help. His parents watched coldly as the other person raised their paws, but in the next moment, his claws fell away. Their parents couldn't believe their eyes as they looked at the severed arm. Slowly, they turned to see the male protagonist appearing behind them. For the cop trying to escape, Shark was no longer of any interest. At that moment, the protagonist coldly regarded his opponent. So, you're the hero, Shark. The death row criminal, Shark. Is there anything else you want to say? The parents, covering the place where the arm used to be, laughed maniacally. Damn, this time it truly is the end. The elder sister felt her younger sibling was trustworthy like a true hero. Thus, she decided to walk the path of a hero herself. However, the first thing the younger sister did upon awakening was to personally send her sister to death row. Their parents, once proud of their daughter, realized that the hero profession was indeed twisted. Some heroes, in their quest to eliminate evil, disregarded the safety of innocence. To address this chaos, Rosa, after becoming the union leader, began to prohibit heroes from killing. The parents, who may have had some issues with their personalities, witnessed countless acts of violence without being able to vent their frustrations, causing their characters to gradually distort. They continued to act as heroes until one day during a mission when they accidentally killed a demon. For the first time, Shark felt discomfort at taking a life. Yet, he soon realized that this feeling was incredibly intoxicating. In his life, this was the first time he felt captivated. In that moment, tears streamed down his face from the overwhelming emotions. Is killing really this exhilarating? From that point on, Shark began a slaughter spree, relishing in the act of killing weaker heroes, as the looks of betrayal in their eyes drove him into a frenzy. But no matter how much paper you use, it can never hide the flames. The scent of fresh blood clung to her, attracting her sister's suspicion. Thus, the younger sister stealthily followed her elder sister outside and witnessed a side of her that no one knew. In that moment, she couldn't believe her eyes, discovering that even Shark was caught off guard. Didn't I tell you not to run around at night? Seeing that everything had been exposed, Shark immediately let go of her defenses. Do you want to join us? The younger sister couldn't believe it, her eyes wide with shock. What are you talking about? Noticing her sister's reluctance to participate, their parents didn't push her either. If that's the case, let us handle it ourselves. But just then, the younger sister let out a scream. Don't. No sooner had the words left her mouth than Shark turned in surprise to see the chains binding her arms. In that instant, the abilities of the younger sister, Tomai, suddenly awakened. Her first act as a hero was against her own sister. From that moment on, Tomai became a hero, while her sister Shark turned into a wanted criminal. Ultimately, the criminal fell into the hands of her own sister. Even after being captured, Shark still laughed, saying, "Now even my sister, The doctor doesn't want to call me Monlesh, but Tomai coldly replied, I don't have a sister like you. What a pity. Now, the parents realize that they have no life left, and they just want to ask a few questions. They heard that the alliance led by Rosa and other heroes have died, which was also confirmed by the male protagonist. Then they asked what they were most interested in. This is the best answer. Parents take a few deep breaths to calm down. This is death. I have long advised her not to be a hero. This is a foolish sister. They finally want to know. Will my sister feel pain after she dies? The male protagonist still remembers the last scene when he saw Sume. In her last moments of life, he always shouted, Pain, save my sister. So he told the shark that your sister would still call you by your name after she died. So, sharks, they have some regrets. If they knew it would make them feel bad, they gave up on sharks at the beginning, and now they are turning around directly. Maybe they just want to rush over and vent their anger towards the white-haired man who killed their sister. Although they know they will die, reality is still cruel. Even if they push their limits in front of the male protagonist, it's not worth watching. An easy kick kicked them away. Parents came back soon, but it still had no effect. The male protagonist punched them and hit them. Immediately, the shark spat out a mouthful of blood. Their transformation mode was immediately canceled. The parents watched as the male protagonist was unwilling to accept it. Now the male protagonist stands on top, coldly watching the shark. Although the criminal has been sentenced to death, killing peers is really uncomfortable. Listening, the shark seems to see hope. They plead with the male protagonist to spare their lives, but the male protagonist is not gentle. How did you beg for someone else's life before? Finally, the shark gave the hero 2 words, his mother, and the whole prison rumble was executed. He just wanted to share some feelings with the young man. The result was considered a sturdy prison, but suddenly, a big hole appeared. Just then, a constant vibration came. The white-haired boy couldn't help but feel excited in his heart. The girl behind him was also a prisoner on the 5th floor. Yet when faced with the provocation from the white-haired boy, she offered no resistance. The boy felt a wave of boredom wash over him, believing that she was far less intriguing. Now he yearned to ascend and meet the protagonist, but in the very next moment, colossal force surged unexpectedly from afar. The white-haired boy was instantly thrown back. Fortunately, this attack caused no real harm, it merely startled him. At that moment, a figure began to slowly approach the white-haired boy. Are you feeling bored, little one? Grandpa has come to play with you. Sensing the extraordinary aura emanating from the figure before him, the white-haired boy finally felt a spark of interest. Indeed, this old man was terrifying. Meanwhile, the elderly man wore a gentle smile. Why so frightening? I'm just a kind old man who loves children. At this moment, in the surveillance room, the guards were in a state of panic, reporting to the director. Right now, on the 5th underground level, Old Man Kingston is facing off against the white-haired boy, Huang Thin-Han. The director gazed at the monitor with satisfaction. Truly, when 2 tigers fight, one is bound to be injured. At this time, the director eagerly hoped for Kingston to prevail. After all, he was a dangerous individual. He was the first criminal imprisoned in Ruculus prison and also the longest-serving inmate. Unlike other criminals who bore the weight of countless lives, his life was marked by only 3 kills. Moreover, he had willingly surrendered himself to the prison. Yet, the first person he killed was the strongest villain of that time, while the other 2 were the mightiest heroes. He had suddenly appeared and taken down the 3 most powerful beings in the world without warning. Afterward, he found himself engulfed in an endless void. It was truly lonely. Thus, upon reaching the pinnacle of the world, he voluntarily chose to remain here. Back then, the relationship between the government and the Hero Association was not very good, resulting in his 30-year imprisonment without facing the death penalty. At this moment, the white-haired boy felt a bit annoyed, refusing to play with the old man. Yet, Old Man Kingston was eager to engage with him. He reassured the boy, saying there was no need to fear him, as he had no interest in harming youths. Seeing that his opponent showed no respect, the white-haired boy began to take things seriously. With that, he swung his arm and sent a flurry of flesh orbs flying toward his opponent. Faced with the incoming assault, the old man remained unperturbed and executed his ultimate move, flowing water technique. Every orb was deflected, and soon after, they shattered into pieces. Blood rained down like a torrential downpour. The old man smiled at his opponent and asked, "Isn't there any other form of attack?" However, what awaited was the response from the white-haired boy. "Playing with you is so boring after all. You're about to die." The elderly man fell into silence. "The younger generation today is truly arrogant," he muttered. "I've seen countless like you, always conceited, believing themselves to be the strongest." With that, he stomped down hard. The once solid ground erupted into chaos. Feeling disrespected, the elderly man began to reveal his true nature. That last kick not only shattered the ground beneath 5 layers, but it also sent tremors throughout the entire prison. At this moment, the prison warden remained oblivious to the gravity of the situation, clinging stubbornly to his faith in the prison's impenetrable defenses. However, when the old man finally unleashed his power, he leaped high, both feet aimed straight at the face of the white-haired boy. Fortunately, the boy reacted swiftly and managed to dodge. Yet, this prison was far from easy. The violent impact left the protagonist in disbelief. As the chaos settled, the guards were left pale and terrified. Just because the prison, once deemed solid, now had a gaping hole. Witnessing this scene, the warden felt as if the sky had fallen upon him. The white-haired boy gazed with intrigue at the old man's handiwork. He was about to follow him outside when suddenly the sound from behind interrupted him. 3 figures, who had been watching the spectacle, now stood directly in front of them. The boy turned around in shock, realizing he hadn't noticed them approaching. The warden, from his elevated position, couldn't believe that someone could appear out of thin air on the 5th floor. But the girl merely glanced at the camera and said, "Hello, audience. We're heading out." In an instant, all the surveillance systems on the 5th floor went dark. The warden slammed his fist on the table in frustration. Meanwhile, the protagonist had just cleared the lower floor and stood at the threshold of the next level. He opened the communication line, requesting the warden to unlock the door, but was met with a voice asking him to wait. The protagonist fell silent for a moment before muttering, "Is it because we're underground that the signal is so weak?" With that, he slipped his hand into the door's crack, and soon after, the massive door began to creak open. He descended the steps, and this level felt vastly different from the 2 above. Don't mention any people, not even a corpse could be seen, casting doubt in the air. Suddenly, a scream pierced through the silence. The protagonist turned towards the sound, spotting a female officer rushing towards him, with a few monsters in pursuit. At that moment, the woman recognized the protagonist ahead. She shouted his name, Brother Four. Just as the monsters were about to pounce on her, he swiftly intervened, effortlessly sending them flying. The relieved woman rushed to embrace him, but he coldly pushed her away. The protagonist looked at the woman before him and explained that he was the younger brother of Jiang Hao. Upon hearing this, she immediately realized, "So, you must be the hero, Hua Jiangliu." She cheerfully greeted him and introduced herself, smiling as she extended her hand toward him. "I am your future sister-in-law. I hope you will take good care of me." The protagonist's expression turned to one of surprise, having never heard his brother mention this before. Meanwhile, in a simple room on the 2nd underground level, it belonged to a pair of siblings. All the inmates on this level, they were all turned into puppets by them. At that moment, the younger sister felt the heartbreaking loss of her beloved dog. Wenyan, her brother, simply remarked, "Really, that person truly deserves to go to hell." The protagonist couldn't have imagined that he was actually saving someone. And that someone turned out to be his future sister-in-law. Even more surprising, she was pregnant. This meant that his brother would finally have an heir. Realizing this, the protagonist instantly felt the urge to personally escort his sister-in-law away. After all, his future child must not fall into danger. However, Stun believed that his abilities were crucial here, as these siblings were the disciples of the legendary Margot. They could summon demons and turn people into puppets. Currently, not only were all the prisoners on this floor under control, but also various alerts in this area. If the siblings could dismantle their powers, the alerts could revert to their original state, and the protagonist couldn't distinguish between them. However, Stun's ability could reveal those alerts by peering into the memories of others. Of course, he reassured the protagonist that he wouldn't use this ability on him. Still, the protagonist was reluctant to take him along. To him, the future child was of utmost importance. Yet as a police officer, Stun couldn't just walk away easily. The protagonist had no choice but to compromise. To be safe, he used his abilities to shield Stun. They had barely walked a distance when they encountered a tangle of trouble. Immediately, Stun activated his powers and identified one of the alerts. He even wanted the protagonist to subdue them first before classifying them. But in the next moment, he found himself completely restrained. For the protagonist, the only classification that mattered was the alert. The other prisoners were all worthless. The siblings in the solitary room observed everything outside through a crystal orb. They realized that this person seemed even stronger than their master and more formidable than the woman who had captured them. Younger sister felt a hint of fear, while her brother could only reassure her, saying, "Don't be afraid, I won't let them kill us easily." After dealing with a group of prisoners, the protagonist released Stun. Curious, Stun asked why the other had acted that way. The protagonist explained it was to execute the prisoners. Stun was quite displeased with this. He believed that the alerts shouldn't kneel, their responsibility was to reform the prisoners. He wanted to continue preaching, but was coldly interrupted by the protagonist. He was tired of such talk. He understood better than anyone the consequences of blindly pursuing ideals. Those beasts would certainly not appreciate this. He was merely doing what he should have done long ago, eliminating those who were even less than animals. Stun still wanted to persuade him, insisting they were human. However, the protagonist grew even angrier. "What nonsense are you spouting? Are they even human?" Stun attempted to convey that some had their reasons, but the protagonist interjected, stating that everyone in this world carries their burdens. Did those they killed not have their own struggles to bear? He refused to entertain the meaningless words of his adversaries. If he did, he would send them away for good. Everything must proceed on his terms. Once again, faced with chaos, Stun attempted to categorize the warnings. As the protagonist prepared to execute the prisoner, Stun spoke up. If Jiang Hao knew about this, he would undoubtedly be heartbroken. At those words, the protagonist's fury ignited, transforming him into a beast. Years of pent-up rage surged forth, overwhelming him. All he wanted was to obliterate everything in sight. The relentless anger, bottled up amidst the filthy blood of those wretches, finally began to seep out. Meanwhile, in the fifth basement, the girl could only think how much more handsome the man she admired had become. Little did the protagonist know his powerful strike had just been countered. Moments ago, he had encountered the brothers, who possessed the ability to turn people into mere puppets. The kind-hearted protagonist urged them to relinquish their powers, believing it would grant them a more merciful end. At that moment, the sister trembled in fear, while the brother pleaded for mercy. However, despite their pitiful state, the protagonist felt no sympathy. From the second basement onward, each person was burdened with countless sins. He would not afford them any choice. The brothers attempted to prolong their lives. After revealing their master was a friend of the protagonist. Even Rosa, who had captured them, was lenient due to their connection. They claimed they could shed their powers if only the protagonist would spare them. Yet, he declined without hesitation. Sensing the precarious situation, Stun urged the brothers to put on the collars immediately. Yet, they defiantly refused, believing they were not at the brink of death. As the protagonist prepared to unleash his wrath, the brothers desperately hoped he would grant them a chance to explain. Stun also hoped the protagonist would engage them peacefully, but the protagonist refused to entertain their empty words regardless of their reasoning. They had taken countless lives, an undeniable truth. As he struck, the brothers hung helplessly in the air. The protagonist intended to teach them a lesson before they relinquished their powers, unaware that in their capture, they emitted a blinding light. The brothers felt the protagonist's actions were absurd, labeling him a monster rather than a human. With that, they vanished in an instant. Only 2 unfortunate souls remained. It turned out they possessed special abilities. The protagonist found this predicament rather bothersome. Currently, he was not displeased with the puppets before him, but rather by the mere audacity of each one claiming to be a monster. My younger sister saw the male protagonist through the crystal ball and was so scared that she broke out in a cold sweat. Her brother next to her tried to dig the wall and nervously asked if he needed help, but she only told him to focus on his work. If he couldn't win the direct battle, he would quickly find a way to escape. Then, her sister fully activated her abilities, and a huge summoning appeared in front of the male protagonist. In an instant, countless monsters crawled out of the summoning, which looked more powerful than puppets. The protagonist found it easier to deal with them since they weren't human, sparing him the worry of accidentally killing the sister. In fact, no monster could stand against him for an entire week. Witnessing his summoned creatures being dispatched effortlessly, the sister was thrown into a panic. She turned to urge her brother, but he replied that he needed about 10 more minutes to finish. Hearing this, the sister immediately bit down on her own finger, desperate to buy a little more time. But before she could act further, a powerful shockwave crashed over them. A thunderous explosion echoed as the prison door was shattered with a single kick. They couldn't believe their eyes as they turned to see the man standing before them. It turned out that the protagonist had cleverly deduced that by capturing the two of them, he could seize control over everything. Therefore, he chose a shortcut. At this moment, the protagonist offered them a final chance to relinquish their abilities, allowing for a more peaceful death. However, despite their overwhelming fear, the siblings showed no intention of surrendering. The brother simply raised his hand. Suddenly, massive magic circles appeared high in the air. The protagonist looked up in astonishment, only to see 4 mighty archangels summoned before him. Yet even this spectacle couldn't prevent the protagonist's gentle kick from landing. The two were left in disbelief as they turned to look back. Could this truly be the extent of what humans were capable of? With no retreat left, the brothers summoned all the police, hoping to use them as leverage against the protagonist, threatening to kill them all if he dared to approach. But he quickly fell silent, stunned, as a scream of agony echoed beside him. He could hardly believe his eyes when he turned to look. His sister had been captured. The protagonist coldly spoke, "If you don't release your sister, she will suffer a painful death." As the protagonist's words sank in, the sister shrieked, "It hurts so much." Seeing her in such distress, the brother could no longer bear it. He knelt before the protagonist, pleading to remove the powers, just hoping for his sister's life to be spared. They had one more request, to speak with Stun. However, the protagonist merely glared at him coldly. "First, remove your abilities." Ultimately, the siblings had no choice but to forfeit their powers. Both the warnings and the prisoners returned to normal. The prisoners, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, fell victim to the protagonist's execution. As for the remaining warnings, he let them leave on their own. Finally, the protagonist kept his promise to take them to meet Stun, but they had to change locations, as this place was unsuitable for a pregnant woman. He released Stun, informing him that the siblings had something to say before their demise. Stun advised the protagonist to spare them this once. "Just let them keep their control devices," he suggested, but the protagonist shot him a dark glance. If he had to repeat those words, Stun would be too frightened to utter another sound. The siblings only asked Stun one question: "Did we really commit such a grave crime?" "We're not guilty of such a great crime, are we? Just say something." The male protagonist, Wenyan, urged Stun to speak plainly. Yet, as he looked at the two children clinging to each other, Stun remained silent for a long time, unable to utter a single word. The pair of siblings gazed at Stun with disbelief. Pantheon was baffled by the scene. Clearly, they meant no harm, but the protagonist was indifferent to that. He had kept his promise. Now it was time to carry out the death sentence. The brother held his weeping sister tightly, their desperate eyes pleading with the protagonist. Yet he offered no sympathy. With a fierce punch, he struck the siblings, the sound of the impact echoing like thunder. However, after the blow, the protagonist's expression changed drastically. A colossal figure appeared behind them, shielding them protectively. The twin siblings stared in shock at the familiar silhouette of their teacher, while the protagonist was equally taken aback. "Margot, what on earth is happening?" The twins only knew to obey their teacher, striving to be well-behaved children, yet at only 11 years old, they had summoned a power of their own. Just moments ago, the protagonist had thrown a punch, only to have it blocked by Margot. He gazed incredulously at the figure before him. Could it be that these twins were capable of summoning an illusion? But the protagonist quickly regained his composure. They couldn't possibly have such formidable defense. Therefore, there was only one explanation. It was a power Margot had used herself. The protagonist couldn't fathom why she would do this, despite being his disciple in the past. Nevertheless, this wouldn't change anything if one punch wasn't enough. He would follow up with a second. Under the fearful gaze of the siblings, the protagonist unleashed another punch. The surrounding space shattered like glass. Yet in the very next moment, more defensive spells activated. Anger surged within the protagonist as he took in this scene. What had that old bastard done? Why had he gone to such lengths with Hive? Once more, the protagonist shattered Margot's shield. The brother, still protecting his sister, held her tightly as she teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. Gradually, an unsettling feeling blossomed within the protagonist's heart. Margot had been a mentor to the protagonist when he became a hero. He had taken in many homeless children, and the team members often enjoyed visiting and playing with them. However, the protagonist always felt out of place. During these times, Margot would take a moment to talk with him. Rumor had it that the protagonist and his brother were very close, and Margot generously allowed him to act like a spoiled child. Of course, the protagonist flatly rejected this notion. But all this warmth had been shattered by the old white-haired man. That day, the protagonist's eyes had been stained with long streaks of blood. Even in his final moments, Margot had comforted him, urging him not to be sad. Everything will pass. Now, the protagonist mechanically continued to strike the shield. As Margot's barrier dwindled to its last breath, he finally halted, eager to hear the reason behind Margot's actions. So the male protagonist put Zia down, wanting to see what the old man was thinking, and then Zia activated his ability, making Margot's memory appear in his palm. The three cute little characters were obviously very cute, but being ridiculed by the male protagonist as disgusting, as soon as he finished speaking, the happy little scene suddenly became boring. But the male protagonist was curious why there were memories of these twins. This is because Margot used his abilities on them, definitely not intentionally giving up. The male protagonist doesn't mind this, because no matter what their story is, he will execute them. Regarding his two disciples, the next step is for Zia to showcase their past memories. At that time, the two brothers, who were only 6 years old, were sold by their terrible father to a dark place where capable and physically strong people were always popular. Therefore, the two hid their power for a long time without being sold, until one day a woman bought them. The reason she wanted two children who could summon angels and demons was to see what would happen if angels and demons mated. When they were too young, they had no idea what it was, but still felt that it was not a good thing. Just then, a loud bang hit their heads and flattened the auction house. At the same time, everyone inside was protected by a barrier. It was Margot and his assistant Rifa who came to rescue those who might be captured. The two brothers looked up at the sky in surprise. When Margot released all the arrested people with all the auctioneers at the same time, just as they were about to leave, two anxious children called them and realized that the old man in front of them was a summoner, so they said he was also a summoner and hoped he could take them away. Margot stopped and asked them to demonstrate their abilities. The next second, they summoned angels and demons. This special summoning caught Margot's attention, so he was happy to accept these two disciples. So Margot taught them for 3 years, and the most important thing in the summoning system was imagination. They can use various abilities while also focusing on one they like. Margot was curious about which path they would take, and their answer surprised Margot because they cared about heaven and hell, as their mother had said before her death that good people would go to heaven. The phrase "bad people go to hell" has always inspired them to come this far. They want to listen to their mother's words, take good people to heaven and bad people to hell, and make the world a better place. At that moment, Margot was blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation. She felt only joy from their kindness. But one fateful day, the Hero Association unexpectedly sought Margot's assistance, compelling her to leave for an extended period in pursuit of a criminal. Upon hearing this news, the siblings pleaded with their teacher not to leave, begging to accompany her. Yet, the enemy was far too dangerous. Margot could not take them along. At that moment, her younger sister wept tragically, terrified of being abandoned once again. Ultimately, they could not change the outcome. Margot bestowed upon them a parting gift, using her powers to shield them. She arranged a safe haven for them, hoping they could grow into good children there. However, past experiences had instilled in the siblings a deep reluctance to connect with others easily. Thus, they chose not to go to the safe haven, but instead found a secluded place to hone their abilities. At the same time, they began contemplating the true nature of good and evil, yearning for the day they could reunite with their teacher. After 2.5 years, they finally distinguished good from evil by their own standards. They returned to their long-forgotten homeland and, using their abilities, sent the virtuous to heaven. They cast the wicked down to hell. At the tender age of 11, they began crafting their own visions of heaven and hell, carving out a unique realm that belonged solely to them. What despair could lead to such profound anguish in an 11-year-old girl's expression? Not long after, the twin children returned to their homeland, summoning angels and demons to monitor the villagers' every move. They spent an entire month determining who deserved to ascend to heaven and who ought to descend into hell. Their criteria were rooted in the lessons their mother had taught them as children: no stealing, no lying, no littering, no fighting, and many more. These notions were merely the innocent thoughts of children, yet it was that very innocence that often rendered them more terrifying. Even those who met their standards were not spared. They would forever be trapped in the alluring dream of a beautiful paradise. Thus, these two 11-year-olds transformed their homeland into a distorted Eden. This immediately caught the attention of the Hero Association. To address the issue, President Authority summoned heroes for a meeting. However, only 3 heroes showed up this time, indicating a significant decline in the president's once-sturdy reputation. The president handed them the documents in his grasp. Glancing at the tiny figures of the children depicted, 2 of them initially debated whether to tease the kids first. Yet, when the president revealed their connection to Margot, their expressions shifted instantly. If that was the case, they would let Margot handle it. Just then, a woman who had been silent until now raised her hand. "May I take on this mission?" The third-level hero, Kato, revved up her beloved motorcycle as she headed back to the twins' hometown. Gazing up at the radiant sky, she couldn't help but marvel at the magnificent sight before her. On the other side, the 2 brothers also caught sight of the invader through the crystal orb. The woman, fully aware she had been discovered, remained unfazed, leisurely pulling out her phone to take pictures. Simultaneously, she noticed that these individuals seemed to still be alive. Suddenly, she felt something and turned around, only to see the 2 brothers landing on the form of a puppet. They nervously asked what the woman was doing here. However, her eyes sparkled with intrigue. It truly was a convenient ability. The older brother urged her to cut to the chase and answer his question quickly. Unexpectedly, she turned the question back on him. "The teacher knows you are special, doesn't he? You didn't tell him, did you, Whites? After all, he only accepts students from the summoning system." Upon hearing this, the 2 brothers were immediately shaken. The older brother loudly demanded to know who she was. In response, she introduced herself as Kato, asserting that she was their senior. Initially, they completely disbelieved her. Clearly, only Rifa was their senior. Unexpectedly, she stated that because she was only interested in sharp things and ignored the teacher's training in defensive magic, she had been abandoned. At that moment, her face twisted in a grimace. She screamed incessantly about the cruel treatment she received. Her frenzied appearance sent chills down the spines of the 2 younger brothers. What they never expected was that this deranged woman would conjure countless weapons aimed directly at them. The scene instantly plunged them into terror. Seeing this, the older brother stepped in front of his sister, demanding her to stop. But in the very next moment, the enemy struck. Many villagers lost their lives, all because she wanted Margot to remember her once more. As they returned to their own bodies, they were horrified to gaze into the crystal orb. What on earth was this? The sensation of the woman who had slaughtered so many villagers was now filled with an unprecedented sense of comfort. At this moment, all she desired was more. Finally, she approached the two brothers. Back in their own bodies, the two stared at the crystal orb with terror-stricken eyes. What was this thing? The feeling of the woman who had taken so many lives was now overflowing with vitality. At that moment, he only wanted more. Ultimately, he moved closer to the two brothers. However, they were blocked by their barrier. The woman praised them for their defensive skills, but emphasized that their offense still needed more practice. Finished speaking, she unleashed her power, cleaving the puppet that was preparing to attack from behind in two. He had always hoped for a place where he could unleash his full potential. But if he truly did that, even as a hero, he would be captured. Who would have thought that someone was now preparing the stage for him for? Knowing that those people were still alive, the woman looked up at the sky with wild eyes, raising her hands high to channel all her strength into her abilities. In the next instant, a colossal artistic blade pierced through the clouds, plummeting from the heavens. Seeing this, the woman was overwhelmed with joy, momentarily forgetting herself. Finally, he had done it. I have never seen anything so grand and awe-inspiring. Everything was thanks to the two of you. With that, the woman reached out, wanting to resolve everything. He, in his moment of triumph, was completely oblivious to the danger approaching from behind. Instantly, he was swallowed by a massive maw, leaving only one arm protruding outside. His brother could hardly believe it, his eyes wide in shock. He stared in disbelief at the gigantic monster that had suddenly appeared before him. It turned out that the woman had transformed, acting like a demon, fully awakening the previously weak sister within her. At that moment, his eyes were filled with tears, his entire being engulfed in darkness. Yet, at the same time, his power reached an unprecedented peak. The older brother anxiously turned to look at his sister, who had recovered but was still tear-streaked. "I just killed someone, didn't I?" The brother hugged her tightly. "No, you didn't kill a person, you vanquished a monster." How tragic that the siblings met their end. When Maggot returned to the Hero Association, it was a year later. By then, the two siblings had created a greater Eden. As he looked at the report in his hand, Maggot could hardly believe what had transpired. Without a moment's hesitation, he wanted to rush to their side, but was stopped by the chairman. It was simply because Maggot had failed to complete his mission to eliminate the criminals, leaving it to the local authorities. Of course, Maggot was not one to back down easily. He had to get there. The chairman's attitude was equally resolute. With one hand, he smashed the stone table in front of Maggot, who stood firm amidst the surrounding formations. As the scene of impending conflict unfolded, an unexpected voice interrupted between the two. At that moment, a third-tier hero named Rosa expressed his willingness to take on the mission. Chairman Van Gon immediately agreed, assuring him that completing this task would elevate his rank. But Maggot opposed this. However, soon after, Rosa stepped forward, facing Maggot directly. At that moment, he simply said one thing: "Please trust me." Rosa accepted the mission and set off to the Eden of the siblings. Immediately, they sensed an intruder. Thus, they quickly merged into the puppet that stood before Rosa. They questioned him about who he was and why he was here. Rosa introduced herself as a hero, here to take them away. However, the moment they heard the word hero, the two siblings were instantly stirred, especially the younger sister. In a flash, she summoned countless monsters. Furious, the sister demanded that he leave immediately, or she would send him straight to hell. In response, Rosa calmly stated, "No problem, but I want to take you with me." As soon as she finished speaking, all the monsters she summoned vanished in a golden light. While Rosa remained still, the vast gap in power made the siblings feel hopeless. After dispatching the monsters, Rosa stepped closer to them. At that moment, he sensed their inherent goodness, as their attacks carried no intent to kill. Yet he felt deep regret for them. If only it had been their first encounter with a kind-hearted hero, perhaps they wouldn't find themselves in such despair today. Rosa told them that their actions were wrong and that their teacher was heartbroken. The shocking news about their mentor widened their eyes in surprise. Could it be that their teacher had returned? Was he lying? Nevertheless, Rosa gently encouraged them to release their powers and return to their mentor. Sensing the warmth radiating from him, the two finally reached out their hands. In that moment, three figures, large and small, intertwined. As the siblings stepped forward, they found their teacher waiting for them. Excitedly, they rushed into his embrace. In that fleeting instant, the older brother tearfully confessed to their teacher. They revealed their special abilities and apologized for thinking he only accepted students specializing in summoning. Hearing this, Maggot was taken aback. He had never said such a thing, he merely asked who had said that. When they mentioned a hero named Kado claiming to be his student, Maggot was instantly bewildered. He clarified that he only had 3 students, them and Liphus. As for that person, he had only guided him once. At this revelation, the siblings were left speechless. They had worried for so long about this. Next, Maggot understood how hard they had worked over the years to become good children. He then asked Rosa to hand them over to him. However, that request was turned down. Even though they were just children, the law remained the law, and reforming delinquents was not the duty of a hero. Still, Rosa felt that there were many issues in this world. He invited Maggot to join him in this endeavor. At that moment, he was determined to change this world. Maggot was moved by his conviction and agreed to become his ally. Of course, he would use his powers to protect his students, ensuring that no one could harm them. What they needed to do next was to change this world before they grew up. After watching this flashback, the protagonist fell into silence. For it was Rosa who had invited him to become a hero, and the first words that touched him deeply were, "Do you want to change the world with me?" China urges the protagonist to spare the 2 siblings. He acknowledges their guilt, but insists they simply lack proper guidance. However, at this moment, the protagonist dismisses her words as meaningless and raises his hand to bind China. With icy determination, he strides toward the 2 siblings, prompting the elder brother to tightly embrace his sister in fear. Desperate, they plead for mercy from the protagonist, but all they receive is a chilling silence. In this harrowing moment, a wave of panic washes over them as they cry out for their teacher. Just then, the protagonist's furious punch reverberates through the prison, shaking it to its foundations. Yet this punch does not land upon the siblings instead, it shatters the ground beneath. In that instant, the protagonist feels his rage ignite. The woman had clearly harbored intentions to change the world, yet she has done nothing. Moreover, he is at a loss for how to deal with the 2 before him. But the burden of his turmoil swiftly dissipates as in the next moment, the 2 siblings suddenly disintegrate. The shocking scene leaves the protagonist reeling. Just then, laughter echoes around him as 3 bizarre figures materialize from thin air. In response, the protagonist remains unresponsive, staring blankly at the rain of blood pouring down, mingled with the floating garments of the siblings. At this moment, an overwhelming sense of despair surges within him. Indeed, this is a wretched world. Suddenly, a girl steps forward, standing before the protagonist. "What troubles you, my love?" she asks, her voice calm yet assertive. This marks the first time she has openly expressed her feelings for the man before her, only to be met with a punch filled with lethal intent. This is the consequence of him having just brutally slain a pair of innocent teenagers. Hardly surprising. Her blow was effortlessly intercepted by his subordinate. Coughing lightly, the girl attempts to introduce herself, but her counterpart swiftly breaks her defense, throwing a fist toward her face. However, facing such a merciless attack, the girl remains utterly unfazed. She simply raises a hand, conjuring a square barrier that neutralizes the protagonist's strike. Under the frigid gaze of the protagonist, the girl introduces herself. "I am Shinka, the controller of special space." Shinka shares a goal akin to that of the 2 siblings who just perished. Her aim is to establish an Eden for a new humanity. Yet in this world, only those with superpowers are permitted to exist, as she believes current humans are gradually degenerating. If this trend continues, it will inevitably lead to extinction. The culprits behind this turmoil aren't villains or heroes, but ordinary people living mundane lives without power. She insists that only those with superior genes are worthy of reproduction. However, to protect the ordinary, many of these elites have sacrificed themselves, allowing the genes that should have been eradicated to propagate. Like the team led by the hero Rosa, they are truly exceptional according to the laws of nature. They should be the ones to survive. However, in their quest to protect ordinary people, they all perished. To change this dire situation, they must eliminate the heroes who hinder the evolution of humanity, as well as all those deemed inferior, creating a world where only the powerful could survive. Upon hearing this, Old Juan immediately complained. Compared to this, Old Juan merely wished to grant everyone true superpowers, akin to a deity. At that moment, the protagonist felt utterly exhausted, his spirit long since depleted. He truly hadn't expected to encounter a madwoman at this moment. Of course, Shinka thought otherwise. She considered herself the most rational person in the world. To prove this, the two behind her nodded in agreement. At this time, Shinka invited the protagonist to join their organization. At that moment, she would be Eva, while the protagonist would take on the role of Adam. Together, they could forge the finest new humanity. Moreover, she kindly explained that her primary objective was actually the white-haired boy, and thus they spared no effort, even employing electric shocks to save him. Unfortunately, he is not yet of adult age, so the clever Shinka came up with a perfect solution to have the protagonist play the role of Adam before reaching adulthood. At that time, the two selected people can also give up the prejudice of becoming a loving family. After saying all of this, Shinka asked the male protagonist if he understood, but at this moment, the male protagonist only understood one thing. In other words, the person behind this attack is you, isn't he? Did you see it? Suddenly, Shinka thought of something. He thought the enemy's brother was no longer there, but he didn't find it strange. Because he could offer the protagonist a new family, he smiled and asked, "So, have you made your decision?" The protagonist coldly replied, "Decision. I've been ready for a long time. I will crush you all and send you to a place of nothingness." The chaotic scene sent shivers down the spines of Sinkard's henchmen. It seemed the situation was not looking good. Yet, Sinkard remained unfazed. After all, arguments between couples were just a normal occurrence, right? It was precisely these conflicts that helped them understand each other better. The male protagonist finally met the white-haired boy he had been longing for, and in an instant, a killing aura that could destroy the universe burst out of his body. But Shinka remained calm. Even as his fatal blow was about to hit him, he simply raised one hand lightly, and a second later, a space door appeared between the two main characters. He was immediately transferred outside the Ruculus prison, and when the protagonist looked calmly at him, he saw the figure of the new card appear in midair. He told the protagonist to calm down outside, and then disappeared. However, the protagonist felt an eerie chill enveloping him, one that sent shivers down his spine. Suddenly, he descended like a shooting star, accompanied by a powerful tremor that shook the very foundations of the prison. At that moment, what was once deemed impenetrable crumbled, and even the three adversaries could do nothing but watch as a massive hole was blasted open. The protagonist successfully returned to his original position. Gazing at Sinkard, who was awestruck by his incredible display, he couldn't help but exclaim. Yet, the protagonist had no desire to hear any more unnecessary words. Without hesitation, he unleashed a punch. Immediately after, the three opponents shifted space, appearing on the other side. Realizing the situation, the protagonist kicked fiercely, but once again, his opponent vanished, leaving the ground behind to bear the brunt of the chaos. When they reappeared, it was behind the protagonist. At that moment, Sinkard felt as if he were playing a thrilling game of hide-and-seek. Seeing this, the protagonist decided to take things a bit more seriously. As anxiety surged, his hands morphed into sharp claws. Sinkard's eyes widened in astonishment at this spectacle. This is just too cool. But no sooner had he spoken than the protagonist accidentally grabbed Sinkard's face. Although he managed to dodge this time, the next reappearance left Sinkard visibly rattled. In that moment, he shouted for them to stop, hoping the protagonist could pause for a brief second. But before he could finish his plea, the the protagonist's claws were already inches from his face. Despite his ability to teleport multiple times, he couldn't escape the protagonist's speed, which was as relentless as a shadow. Ultimately, Singcard's space-shifting ability was caught up with by the protagonist. Now he was utterly terrified. But in that decisive moment, Kate, with her cat-like eyes, suddenly leaped onto the protagonist's back. He found himself sprawled across the protagonist's shoulders. Emitting a cute mewl like a kitten, Kate's presence made Singcard immediately anxious. Why are you interfering with someone else's business? If he gets caught, you'll die. Before he could finish his sentence, the protagonist forcefully slammed Kate to the ground, and once wasn't enough, he did it again. The other two, lurking in the shadows, calmly observed the unfolding scene. As the protagonist finally halted, the ground was devoid of any remnants. It was clear he intended to deal with the one in his grasp, yet Singcard's voice echoed in the protagonist's ear once more. Suddenly, a new Kate appeared beside Singcard. See, I told you if he caught you, you would die. Indeed, Kate was proving to be worthy of her reputation, perhaps possessing 9 lives. At that moment, he turned to Singcard and asked, "So what do we do now?" Observing the protagonist's unwavering expression, Singcard let out a resigned sigh. What a pity. At this point, tears streamed down his face. Those genetic traits were truly precious. Was it really necessary to go this far? However, the protagonist remained unperturbed, even more serious than before. As the Mop 5 activated, countless electric orbs surrounded him, crackling with energy. Singcard realized that no matter how much he spoke, it would be futile. Therefore, he decided not to linger any longer and directly initiated the multidimensional space. Instantly, dozens of new portals materialized, each revealing a shadow stepping forth. This is an ultimate summoning technique that leaves the male protagonist stunned. Now, with a gentle expression, Simka tells the male protagonist to greet them and tells them that from now on, they will become new humans. The first to step forward is Edward, who has been chased by Margot for many years. He couldn't accept that he died so easily. This should be done by him. In addition, 9 other people from the 3rd underground floor appeared, as did 5 people from the 4th underground floor and 5 people from the underground floor. All the surviving prisoners, except for the old man whose fate remains a mystery, have gathered here. Upon meeting familiar faces, the white-haired boy greets the protagonist with joy, but as soon as he lays eyes on him, a wave of murderous intent erupts from the protagonist today. At this moment, he resembles nothing less than a monstrous beast. When Zero is activated, his ferocious aura soars high into the sky. Witnessing the monstrous stance of his opponent, the white-haired boy is equally thrilled. Facing the charging protagonist, he shows no signs of fear. On the contrary, he joyfully spreads his arms wide. Then, let's have some fun together once more. The protagonist has transformed into an unimaginable monster, yet there's someone who feels it's still not enough. Just moments ago, the protagonist and the white-haired boy clashed in a fierce battle of ice and fire, the explosive sounds echoing throughout the prison. Sensing the situation escalating, the prison staff hurriedly advised the warden to retreat. At this moment, the warden was so frightened that he lost his bearings. He never expected things to spiral out of control like this. In their first encounter, the 2 combatants were evenly matched. The white-haired boy was truly formidable. Wild fighting styles of the 2 made the nearby prisoners gaze in awe. The prisoners in the 3rd and 4th basement levels had all been captured by Rosa's team, yet they had never witnessed a fighting style like that of the protagonist. Now they finally understood why Rosa, the Holy Maiden, prevented the protagonist from fighting, because everyone who beheld his form felt one undeniable truth: death. This was the very image of death when it manifested. The sensation was utterly captivating. Some felt a sense of reverence, while others were gripped by sheer terror. So what kind of power was this? Meanwhile, Singcard wore a sorrowful expression. Why can't you all coexist peacefully? Only the white-haired boy radiated happiness. He had finally found someone of his kind. Looking at the monstrous man before him, the white-haired boy felt a surge of curiosity. Why hadn't his opponent displayed this state when they fought before Forength? But the protagonist had no intention of elaborating. With a powerful punch, he aimed directly at his opponent's head. In the face of such a mighty blow, the white-haired boy merely smiled. Is there even more power hidden within you? Just as he finished speaking, a flurry of roosters suddenly fell onto the protagonist. He was sent flying on the spot. In their first skirmish, the protagonist was slightly at a disadvantage, naturally. For an ordinary person, it would have been a fatal injury, but for the protagonist, it felt as trivial as an itch. Steadying himself, the protagonist charged at his opponent once more, but his punch halted just before the white-haired boy, as if stopped by an invisible barrier. It turned out, the white-haired boy had compressed the space in front of him. With a thunderous explosion, the protagonist was sent flying again. The white-haired boy's performance had widened the horizons of the prisoners in the stands. He's still so young. What kind of monster will he become when he grows up? Despite having the upper hand twice in a row, the white-haired boy understands that such attacks won't defeat his opponent. Sure enough, in the next moment, a powerful punch lands squarely on his face. The force of the blow makes the white-haired boy spit out a mouthful of blood. However, the protagonist shows no mercy. Another punch strikes hard into the opponent's stomach. This time, accompanied by a deafening explosion, the white-haired boy is sent flying. Watching the two clash on the ground, the two criminals above can't help but exclaim in awe. Truly, they are two monsters. Little do they know, the protagonist despises being called a monster more than anything. Before they can react, their heads are suddenly severed. Next up is Edward, who Margot had spent years trying to capture. Yet Edward utilizes Margot's defensive magic. It turns out he has the ability to copy the powers of others. Not stopping there, this guy dares to provoke the protagonist. Upon seeing his old teammate's magic, the protagonist feels a wave of nostalgia. But in the blink of an eye, a mere flick of his hand shatters the barrier. As Edward watches the sharp claws closing in, jealousy fills him. Why can't I possess such power? Watching Edward fall apart, see Ronaldo from the fourth basement suddenly kicks the protagonist away. Of course, the protagonist remains unscathed, but now he resembles a monster even more. At this moment, the white-haired boy leaps up, urging everyone to stop, for he wants to play with the protagonist. However, seeing the protagonist like a monster before him, he suspects that the opponent is still hiding his true strength. Thus, he reasonably doubts that the protagonist was once bound by the title of a hero, and now is similarly shackled by his current status. How can this be allowed? The white-haired boy wants both of them to create an unrestricted playground together. Just as the white-haired boy tightens his fists, his power surges forth. In an instant, under the terrified gazes of everyone, the entire prison begins to tremble, and the so-called indestructible cage starts to collapse from the inside out. The reason the white-haired boy does this is to completely free the protagonist. Then, the two will have an epic battle. In his hands, the white-haired boy holds something crucial, the protagonist's brother. Upon realizing the truth, the protagonist's mind shatters completely. Not long ago, the white-haired boy had unleashed his strength to directly assault the notorious and fortified Ruculus prison. This scene causes the prison guards to begin questioning their very lives, as they stand on the verge of being buried alive right here. In the midst of this life-and-death crisis, dark red shadows suddenly appear, protecting all the surviving guards, including the warden. In that fleeting moment, they transform into red blood stars soaring into the sky. The white-haired boy gazes at his creation with satisfaction. He exclaimed that this place clearly showed no signs of cost-cutting. But just then, the main character clenched his fists and charged at him. However, in an instant, a portal materialized right before the white-haired boy. The protagonist was immediately transported to an unknown location. It turned out that the white-haired boy's use of power had stirred up so much dust in this area that Starcard wanted to swap places. But at that moment, Tassi in the fourth basement suddenly picked up a stone. Beginning to activate his powers, Starcard stared at the scene in astonishment, wondering what the opponent was planning. Suddenly, the stone in the opponent's hand transformed into a razor-sharp hunting knife. Tassi then swung the knife toward a sensitive area. The strike created a rift in space, shattering the area. Witnessing this, Starcard couldn't help but be taken aback, his eyes widening in disbelief. But right after that, he quickly opened a teleportation portal to gather everyone. Still questioning why the opponent was exerting so much effort, Starcard's two assistants gazed at him as if he were a fool. At that moment, silence spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, as the protagonist regained his composure, he found himself on a bustling street. Seeing a stranger appear out of nowhere, the crowd immediately halted, curious about this unexpected visitor. In the blink of an eye, another portal opened beneath the protagonist's feet, causing him to vanish and leaving the bystanders in stunned silence. When the protagonist reappeared, a massive gem hovered above him. Without a doubt, it was yet another trick of the white-haired boy. Upon seeing the protagonist, the white-haired boy softly uttered a word, and instantly, the gigantic orb shattered. The unimaginable impact surged straight toward the protagonist. When the dust settled, only a large circular crater remained. Observing this, the white-haired boy slowly descended into the hole while the protagonist knelt on the ground. The recent collision had left him gravely injured. Part of the monster armor on his face had been shattered. Others stood not far away, watching the two below. At the same time, Starcard reminded everyone not to interfere in their battle. The prisoners on the third and fourth floors obeyed Starcard's command, as he had exploited their desires, the emotions that all of humanity shares. He successfully persuaded the criminals to join his alpha world. Of course, there would always be a few stubborn ones who would resist. Starcard felt a twinge of regret for this. However, if they refused, they would have to face death. When it was the white-haired boy's turn, he heard some people wanting to create a new generation, and Starcard even wanted to marry the protagonist before his own turn. He couldn't help but laugh to the point of tears. If he refuses, he will die. As the white-haired boy listened to those before him discussing their desire to create a new generation of humans, Nucard expressed his intent to marry the male lead first, before considering him. It was enough to make him laugh to the point of tears. Truly an intriguing individual. Nucard felt a sense of joy at that thought. Yet, in the eyes of the white-haired boy, women were but fleeting illusions. Only the male lead could bring him true joy. Upon hearing this, Star Tower immediately grew tense, advising the white-haired boy not to chase after mere fleeting pleasures. He needed to think about the future. After all, if the male lead were to perish, what excitement would life hold afterward? But the white-haired boy dismissed such concerns, for there was a possibility he too might meet his end. Vungon fell silent for a moment before suggesting a better idea. If he had a child with the male lead first, then with him afterward, the white-haired boy would have two fascinating playthings. Moreover, as they grew, their powers would also strengthen, allowing them to engage with the male lead in exhilarating ways. Ultimately, Starcard promised the white-haired boy that if he joined them, he would never feel bored again. Such words successfully captivated the white-haired boy. However, he still faced another dilemma. He did not love the woman before him. Could they truly marry later? The white-haired boy was still far too naive. Who said love was necessary for marriage? But Nucard held firm in his confidence, believing that the white-haired boy would eventually come to love him. Time flashed back to the present. The male lead once again delivered a powerful punch to the white-haired boy's abdomen, sending him flying as he spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Yet his body was resilient. This brutal blow was merely a light injury. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, he also wanted to hear something from the male lead. Would he remain silent, or was he too wound up to speak, Roy? To provoke the male lead further, the white-haired boy raised the piece of meat in his hand. "Do you know what this is? This is your brother." No sooner had he finished speaking than the male lead's rage reached its peak. The last thread of his rationality snapped. Blood-like tears streamed from his eyes as he charged forward like a wounded beast. In contrast, the white-haired boy remained nonchalant, as if nothing was amiss. Finally, the white-haired boy struck back. Just as the male lead lunged at him in fury, the white-haired boy merely raised his hand, and millions of shards of stone soared up, transforming into sharp blades aimed directly at the male lead. But the male lead was unfazed. With a single punch, he sent the stones flying. Yet, at that moment, the male lead's punch came to an abrupt halt, for his brother was hovering right before him. In that fleeting moment of distraction, the male lead was knocked back. The white-haired boy seized the piece of meat and began to... He laughed heartily. You seem unable to strike, is that so? An idea just struck me. What if I consume it? Would that spare me from the attack? But it's too large to devour whole. I'll just have to shrink it a bit. Before he could finish his thought, the main character delivered a brutal kick to his chest. He coughed up a mouthful of blood, only to be met with a fierce punch to the face. One blow wasn't enough, so another followed. The sound of the impact echoed all around. The criminals remained indifferent, watching the spectacle unfold. After all, they were not the ones being struck. Yet the white-haired boy refused to yield. He seized the main character's arm, which was tightening around his throat. In a flash of white light, the white-haired boy activated his powers. Instantly, a beam of white light shot upwards into the heavens. This breathtaking scene left everyone in awe. The star card felt that the moment was truly beautiful. If only these two could reconcile, how wonderful it would be. Alas, one of his minions deemed that notion utterly impossible. Another individual nodded in agreement. They sensed that the battle was nearing its end. The white-haired boy's prowess was undeniable. The main character's energy armor had been shattered. Yet, the white-haired boy was not unscathed himself. He now lay unable to rise. At this moment, the main character trembled as he struggled to his feet. Instantly, the white-haired boy's eyes widened in astonishment. He beheld thousands of dark red shadows swirling around the main character, weak yet seemingly resurrected, writhing in every direction. The criminals outside could hardly believe their eyes. What on earth was happening? Those scarlet shadows intertwined to form a blood-red sky, encapsulating both fighters within. Witnessing this, the white-haired boy erupted into maniacal laughter. "How many more tricks do you have up your sleeve?" he exclaimed. Truly, this man was an enigma. Yet in that moment, the white-haired boy grew increasingly curious about the main character's murderous intent. After all, humanity is fragile. A mere nudge could send one into oblivion. It seemed impossible to release pent-up emotions in such a state. The main character demanded silence, but the white-haired boy paid no heed. To him, it appeared that the main character could only unleash his true power when faced with his own challenge. When surrounded by other scum, he had to suppress himself. Of course, the protagonist felt completely unaware of the nature of such a constraint. The white-haired boy truly did not understand. Yet he knew that his body had reached its limits. If nothing unexpected happened, the protagonist's final blow would come. But he felt no fear, only a hint of regret. He wondered if he could grow stronger, as Starcard had suggested. Could he defeat the protagonist? In response to this thought, the protagonist firmly asserted that it was absolutely impossible, for death awaited him here. In the next moment, with a deafening explosion, the blood-red sky began to tremble ominously. Starcard, cold sweat trickling down his spine, witnessed the unfolding chaos and realized what was occurring inside. Worrying for the safety of the white-haired boy, he swiftly opened a spatial door, successfully glimpsing inside, where the boy was pierced by countless bloody blades. Miraculously, the white-haired boy was still alive, contemplating whether there was any chance of revival. If not, the protagonist, a dragon hunter, might risk becoming a monstrous dragon himself. Ultimately, the white-haired boy had not succumbed. Upon seeing his pitiful condition, Starcard quickly pulled him out and urgently called for help. Men with healing abilities rushed to the scene, one of whom placed his hands on the boy's chest to perform CPR. Fortunately, the white-haired boy retained a flicker of life. Indeed, his fighting instincts were formidable. The man successfully healed the boy's wounds while simultaneously absorbing the protagonist's power into himself. As he glanced at the bloodied trails spiraling around his arm, an unease settled in his heart. Thus, without hesitation, the man severed his own arm, only to have a new one sprout in its place almost instantly. So, what should they do now? Everyone decided to take this opportunity to eliminate the protagonist. But Star Tower was unwilling to give up. He wanted to persuade the protagonist one last time. At this moment, the protagonist ignored everyone else, quietly approaching his brother, his face etched with sorrow as he grasped his brother's hand in silence. Just then, new card appeared before the protagonist. He sincerely urged him to join them. However, the protagonist's demeanor suggested he was beyond listening. Newcard genuinely couldn't comprehend the reason behind this. In the next heartbeat, the protagonist was attacked by Edward, an immensely powerful foe. He believed that if their negotiations had failed, the only option was to eliminate the protagonist before he regained his strength. This decision was met with the agreement of the third and fourth tier criminals. Though they felt a pang of regret, they feared the protagonist might survive. The assault commenced with this giant, faceless brute. He launched a powerful punch at the protagonist, but the latter merely tightened his grip on his brother, refusing to let go. Then, the third and fourth tier criminals, the onslaught on the main character commenced anew. Time felt irrelevant as the strikes continued, but he remained defenseless. However, the expression on his face was unchanged, almost as if he had never wavered. A mere crowd could hardly inflict harm upon him. The only instance where the main character utilized his powers was to shield his brother in his grasp. The faceless foe, too, seemed to fantasize about landing a final blow against the main character. I suspect that a kick like this would leave the main character unscathed. Yet this kick was never executed. For the white-haired boy, having just regained consciousness, intercepted the attack. He called out loudly, "Starcard, didn't you say that I would grow stronger with time? This is the first dream I've ever had in my life, so please don't kill him. Let me have this moment." Edward immediately wanted to retort, "Stop babbling. We must seize this chance to eliminate him." But just then, Newcard interjected, "Everyone, let's head back." He looked at them cheerfully. "You all promised to follow my lead." Upon hearing this, everyone fell silent, no longer arguing back. Soon after, Starcard opened a portal for everyone to leave. When it was the turn of the white-haired boy, Starcard excitedly rushed over to boast about his achievements. However, the white-haired boy didn't even spare a glance at the beauty before him. His gaze was filled with admiration, following the silhouette of the male protagonist. "Next time we meet, I will be the victor." At last, the male protagonist had regained his freedom. But even if they hadn't released him, they wouldn't have been able to do anything against him. This incident involved a total of 8 Level 3 criminals, 5 Level 4 criminals, and 3 Level 5 criminals. For the male protagonist, this seemed like a blessing. If all of them were dealt with, he would emerge as the strongest remaining. The world was about to become livelier than ever, just as the old man had mentioned earlier, in the not-so-distant future. Starcard would turn the world upside down. Thinking about the criminals who had just escaped from prison and declared war on the entire world, there were also those who wanted to investigate, who had granted the protagonists the power to execute. Just moments ago, Newcard delivered an engaging speech to the whole globe. Next, he would build a new world. "Welcome, everyone, to the Alpha world." He then introduced his 2 assistants, Canis and Kate. So what exactly is the Alpha world? This world is designed to save humanity from its downfall. It will be guided by Shinka, who will become humanity's Eva. But who qualifies to join the Alpha world? To enter this new realm, 3 conditions must be met. First, one must possess exceptional power. Second, they must not protect the weak. They are not to be chosen. Finally, they must be healthy individuals capable of reproduction. So, what will happen to those who do not meet the criteria? Shinka believes that those with inferior genes existing in this world are a crime, and as offenders, they must prepare to face punishment. Therefore, anyone not chosen will be dealt with. In the coming month, they will send invitations to join the new world to those who qualify. Anyone who refuses will be deemed an enemy and will also be subject to punishment, so think carefully. Finally, Shinka began to pray. "May glory belong to the new humanity. This is your future, Eva, Shinka. Farewell." As Shinka's global address concluded, a secret conference room fell into silence. This was a meeting of the World Security Council. Documents regarding Shinka appeared before the important figures. They could hardly believe their eyes. Just when the heroes under Rosa's leadership had perished, this event had occurred. This should have been addressed immediately, but before delving into the main issue, some still wished to defend those who were wrongfully executed. The leader of the Peace Party, Einstein, was deeply dissatisfied with the prison warden Lucerus having taken it upon himself to execute the protagonist. He could not accept that one individual had the power to arbitrarily decide life and death. He believed this had unleashed a wave of chaos and panic. What a heart full of compassion. Naturally, there were dissenters. Meanwhile, the former president of the Hero Association, Uto, steadfastly sided with the prison warden, asserting that he had made the most prudent decision. Einstein contended that at the very least he should have reported the matter, but time was of the essence. Udo understood the reasoning behind these actions, and after speaking, he turned his gaze towards the Minister of Justice, Egerdo, who stood between them. Egerdo expressed that while he believed one should not execute without due process, in this extraordinary situation, such a decision could be deemed understandable. At that moment, the fire chief was growing increasingly anxious. He wondered if this would harm the populace. In response, the police chief stated that the damage had already been done. Following the live broadcast, public security had spiraled into chaos. Meanwhile, the Deputy Minister of Defense was preoccupied with whether this meant war or simply an escape from prison. At this juncture, the former President Uto slammed his hand down on the table in frustration. If we had eliminated those scoundrels sooner, none of this would have happened. He pointed directly at the young police chief and declared that the current situation was a direct result of their hesitation in carrying out executions. The chief felt deeply wronged, as he had no authority to make such a decision. Uto was profoundly dissatisfied with the alternative process. If it were up to him, those miscreants would have been dead long before any trial took place. He couldn't comprehend why the heroes were unable to pass judgment on criminals, even when they themselves were in peril. He believed that since Rosa had ascended to the presidency, this world had descended into chaos. Yet, Uto's words failed to garner any support. During his presidency, most of the heroes were embroiled in their own issues. In response to this, Uto angrily retorted, "So what? At the very least, keep them in their heroic roles, rather than letting them turn into villains. Some may see the role of a hero as insignificant, yet it's undeniable that ever since Rosa took the helm as president, those who could have been heroes have turned into villains, creating even more chaos." In light of this, the fire chief solemnly declared that his vision of a hero is far different from what I had imagined. Hearing this, Uto nearly exploded with rage. "You're just a bunch of idealists blind to the harsh reality right before your eyes." The president of the world, Bizet, unexpectedly interrupted their argument, leaving everyone wondering what he would say if Rosa were still here. Everyone turned their gazes toward the long table where an empty chair sat. With that, Uto left in his specialized vehicle, feeling utterly disappointed in those around him. He couldn't comprehend why they even bothered discussing such trivial matters. Why not just eliminate those troublesome figures, Meng? It was all Rosa's fault, the one with a kind heart. Since Rosa became the president of the Heroes Association, the supporters of reform, including Rosa, numbered 4, while the proponents of punishment, including Uto, counted only 2. Another individual chose to remain neutral. With a voting ratio of 4-2, their opinions were often disregarded. Even the current president leaned toward Rosa's side. However, with the chair of the Heroes Association now vacant, finding a like-minded individual to fill that position could tip the scales. Only then would their voices hold weight. Thus, he had to meet with the former hero, Xu Jiangliu. He believed that others had begun to take action as well, despite Xu Jiangliu once having a close relationship with Rosa. But now, everything had changed. He instructed the driver to speed up. "Let's go see Xu Jiangliu." At this moment, the protagonist lay still in a hospital bed, receiving treatment from the doctor. Yet perhaps this method of treatment would yield little effect. The greatest suffering stemmed from despair. At this point, he felt nothing but dejection and had nothing left to lose. If only he could revive his spirit, perhaps the protagonist would instantly regain his strength. Why couldn't a hero eliminate criminals? This question had plagued the protagonist ever since he first became a hero. In search of clarity, he hoped to find answers from his teammates, but sadly, each one embodied the essence of saviors. They even questioned why the protagonist would need to kill them. Rosa had told him that a hero's responsibility was not to take lives, but to save them. She invited him to join her in redeeming humanity. He believed he would understand this someday, but regrettably, before that day could come, they had to pay the price for their choices. Even after all that had transpired, some still dreamed of rehabilitating criminals, to the point where even the white-haired boy found it laughable. Little did they know, after everything that had happened, there are still such naive souls. The protagonist jolted awake from his nightmare, gasping for breath, trying to ease the turmoil within. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence beside him. "So you're awake now?" It was Gangyu, a former student of Margot Leifus, an old acquaintance of the protagonist, who stared at him with concern etched on his face. He expressed his worries, asking if everything was all right. Moreover, a wave of guilt washed over him for not being able to help earlier. Though he was aware of the incident in the prison, he had never imagined it would escalate to such a degree. The protagonist simply replied that it was fine, for his presence wouldn't have changed anything. Leifus, taken aback by such a cold response, didn't react with anger. Instead, he felt a deeper concern for the protagonist, questioning whether he was truly okay. Leifus had heard about the protagonist's mission in the prison, yet the protagonist felt far from fine, burdened by the fact that he couldn't eliminate all the criminals. This left him with an overwhelming sense of dissatisfaction. At that moment, the protagonist glanced across and asked if Leifus had come to dissuade him from killing criminals. If so, he should just turn back. "I'm not a hero anymore." Leifus fell silent, then proceeded to explain the upcoming plans. He intended to establish a new Heroes Association, with Leifus temporarily stepping in as president. He had come to invite the protagonist to join them. However, the protagonist showed no interest, stating that he was no longer a hero, and once he recovered, he would pursue the matters he deemed necessary. Leifus sought to persuade the protagonist once more, but was interrupted by an unexpected voice. "Well said, Hero Shine." Standing before him was Utoridi, a former two-term president of the Heroes Association. He admired the protagonist's actions and empathized with the burdens he had borne. However, Utoridi informed the protagonist that such events would no longer occur. He would assume the role of the next president of the Heroes Association and would grant execution powers to the heroes. Leifus was instantly taken aback. What is the representative of the world saying? Utoridi asserted that he would resign to participate in the elections. In fact, he had originally come to ask the protagonist if he was interested in that position, but now it seemed unnecessary. So this visit was merely a greeting. After saying this, he wished the protagonist a speedy recovery and turned to leave. Leifus, now somewhat panicked, called out, "Is there anyone who will vote for him?" Hearing this, Utoridi laughed heartily. "Well, let's wait and see." Sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, Leifus wanted to say something to the protagonist, but the latter, appearing weary and cold, requested him to leave. Leifus stood frozen in shock, utterly bewildered by what was unfolding. How had things escalated to this point? Utoridi returned to his vehicle, everything unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. Everyone was attempting to sway the protagonist. Since the emergence of those with special abilities, the world had transformed. Organizations were increasingly reliant on the strength of these powerful individuals. The World Security Council may soon deliberate on the protagonist's role in passing judgment on criminals and whether he should be granted the authority to execute capital punishment. Even the authority cannot deny that, under current laws, the protagonist's actions are indeed unlawful. However, if the law is as it stands, it can simply be amended. The highest assembly is convened, with the Harmony Party leader resolutely demanding accountability from the prison director for unjustly granting execution powers to the protagonist. A voice in the crowd countered, "Isn't this a unique situation? In moments like this, one should keep one eye open and the other shut." The Harmony Party leader, lost in lofty ideals, was mercilessly interrupted by the authority. "You present no viable solutions, merely discussing meaningless, idealistic scenarios." Ainite claimed he had a solution. Indeed, there is a plan, but the chief of police stated he never agreed to it. His plan dictates that heroes should only apprehend criminals and bring them to justice. To the authority, however, this is nothing short of a grand joke. Observing the escalating tension, the president interjected, "So what is your proposal, Lister?" The authority had come prepared. "Let us hold a vote. Let's allow the people to decide. Should the hero Shine be granted the power to execute capital punishment, To do this, they could amend the laws. So, do you support or oppose granting Hero Shine the authority to carry out executions?